Hello everybody, this is Ethics Now producer Colin Troy. I just wanted to let you know that this episode is a little different than usual. The audio and video was recorded on September 17th during the New Mexico Ethics Watch annual event, Ethics in New Mexico, Election 2020, where our host and NMEW Executive Director Kathleen Sabo addressed ethical issues surrounding the 2020 election with our esteemed guests, New Mexico Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Executive Director of Ole, New Mexico, Andrea Serrano, and Washington, D.C. based Campaign Legal Center President Trevor. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
As I alerted the panelists ahead of time, one thing that was a bit disturbing but also not unexpected was the amount of negative feedback when we posted about this panel and symposium on social media. We would get comments like fake news or how can there be ethics in an election? Isn't that an oxymoron? People taking unmerited attacks upon our governor on the post having nothing to do with the governor and other elected officials. And so we just want to talk a little bit about that level of distrust and in ethics and elections and voting. And I don't know if you saw today in the New York Times, Dan Coates, the former director of the National Intelligence Office, he suggested that there be a bipartisan congressional commission to oversee voting and make sure that, to monitor voting and to make sure that all laws were followed in elections. And in my Facebook feed today was somebody sharing a letter from Bernie Sanders that said, we need social media companies to step up and to not post, erroneous information about elections and voting and attacks upon election officials. So let's just talk a little bit about how we can bolster, how attendees can, how each of you in your work can bolster the trust in our system and our elections. And Trevor, I'm going to go to you first on this because I'm going to go to you last coming up for something else. So good morning, Trevor, and thank you again for being here. But what can we do to bolster trust in our system and in our elections?
I think what's most important is for voters, people who are planning to vote, hoping to vote this November, to understand the options they have and that all of the options are equally valid, and each of them, if they carry them through correctly, will ensure that their vote is counted, because there's a lot of confusion out there about the difference between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots and what happens on election day, and is there some difference between how an absentee ballot counts versus if you vote in person. And there are partisan battles going on those issues around the country. New Mexico has no excuse absentee ballot, meaning anyone can request an absentee ballot. And you also have the ability to vote early in person or to wait and vote in person on election day. So I think what needs to be done is putting out as much information as possible, assuring voters first that they have a range of options, depending on their personal circumstances and whether they are particularly at risk or whether they think their polling place might be particularly crowded. They can request an absentee ballot, and I think it's important people know, of course, the two big rules on that, which is they have to request it by the deadline of October 20, and they have to get it in by election day. Some states say it just has to be mailed by election day, and that's not New Mexico's policy. I am guessing, and Secretary Oliver can confirm, but I'm guessing that it is possible when you've gotten your absentee ballot at home to deliver it in person, either to an early voting site or on election day if you choose. If you don't trust the mail, or if you waited too late to mail it, and we've all read about these issues with the post office, that to be clear there is no question the post office has the capacity to deal with a large volume of absentee ballots. In a single week over the holidays, they deal with 1.5 billion pieces of mail. So, 10% of that at the most is what they're facing spread out over a couple weeks this year on the election. So they have the capacity, but there is a concern that first-class mail may be slower because of cost problems they're having, and in fact, their staff is diminished by people who are ill with COVID. So in those circumstances, it may take a little longer to get the ballots returned. And if somebody thinks they're getting close to the deadline, then there are other ways to put it back. But I think assuring voters that there are ways to vote, there are safe ways to vote, their votes will be counted if they follow the rules, those are really going to be the key here.
And Madam Secretary, so know the facts, and this is a large part of what you've been working on. And certainly, I'm sure we'll get more questions, more specific questions during the Q&A. But what else, other than what Trevor Potter has discussed, helps to bolster the faith in the system and elections?
Well, first of all, Kathleen and Justice Boston, everyone at New Mexico Ethics Watch, thank you for having me here today. And I'm really pleased to be on this panel with two people I really respect, Trevor and Andrea, just doing great work nationally and locally. And, it's funny because Kathleen, you sent us an email a couple of days ago talking about this issue, and I've had some time to think about it. And one of the first reactions that I had, because in my role as Secretary of State, and of course, when I served as county clerk in Bernalillo County for 10 years, I think it's really important that those of us that are running elections have the capacity to separate our personal political viewpoints from our position. When I walk in the door of this office, or any time that I undertake the work of this office, which quite frequently happens when I'm at home, sometimes late at night, I have to take off my personal political hat. And I have to make sure that I am acting in the interest of all New Mexicans, even those who did not vote for me, right? And that when I'm making decisions, I have a lot of authority that's been entrusted to me by the state legislature to oversee and regulate elections in New Mexico. And when I do that, I have to make a decision that is going to equally positively impact the roughneck living in a man camp in southeastern New Mexico as the single mom struggling to get by living in northern New Mexico, right? And so when I make these decisions, that's what I'm doing. And when I communicate with the public, that's what I'm doing. However, to Justice Boston's point and to your question, Kathleen, I recognize that unfortunately, we are living in a time where the fact of my partisan registration undermines my trustworthiness with people from the other side. And so while I cannot sit down one-on-one with every person who has questions about my impartiality, everything that I attempt to do in the office is always coming from a point of view of fairness. And one thing that really struck me is talking about this issue of ethics. So as we all know, ethics and laws are often two different things. Often ethical values are instilled in our laws, but often there are things that we can do that are permissible under law that are not necessarily ethical, right? And I think one of the problems that we are suffering under is that we tend to confuse ethics with disagreeing with a decision, right? And so when I took office, I swore an oath to the Constitution of the state and the United States to carry that out. And if I ever violate that oath of office, I can be held legally liable for that, right? Up to and including, removal from office. So I think it's important for folks to know that we do have this system of checks and balances in place to hold our elected officials accountable, particularly those who are running elections, especially now in light of the fact that we have this Ethics Commission in New Mexico, which our office works very closely with to enforce the ethical laws of the state. The last thing that I'll say for this topic is that I have this thing here called the Election Handbook of the State of New Mexico. It is riveting reading if you're trying to fall asleep at night or otherwise bored. But what I want to let folks know about this, and by the way, we have a huge number of hard copies of these. If you're still a hard copy fan here in our office, you can email us to request that we send you one. This book is rife with processes that have built-in transparency and ethics into our election process. And every election official in the state is required to follow them. And so from every step of the election process, beginning with making sure that machines are tested and are working accurately, that they get into the field properly, that the election in a polling place or at the absentee precinct is overseen. These are all public processes. These are all processes with built-in transparency, so that even if you personally aren't there to oversee and watch the process at a given polling place, there are ways that we can have impartial and external eyes on the process to make sure that the laws are being followed. And that's just the one takeaway that I want everybody to understand, is there is no part of our election process other than keeping your personal private information completely secret that is not public, that is not otherwise available to be observed. And I think it's really important for folks to know that nothing in our election process goes on behind closed doors.
Well, thank you for that, Madam Secretary. And so far from Trevor, we've heard know the facts. We've heard from you, know the system. Trust that when you're in that office, you're working for every New Mexican. Andrea, what would you like to add to this discussion? How can we help to bolster people's trust in the system and in elections?
Thanks for having me this morning.
Absolutely.
This great panel, and thank you to your organization and participants, and really just thinking about this. We at my organization, we engage with voters year round. So whether there's an election or not, we're talking to folks. And I think, there's this idea that people who don't vote are apathetic, or that, they're ignorant of the issues and what's going on, or the process. And it's been our experience that a lot of people have lost faith in voting because there's this feeling that it doesn't do anything, or that elections don't matter. And I think we've seen time and time again, not just in this current political climate, but we've seen time and time again that elections do have consequences and elections do matter. But it's really about having that conversation with folks and meeting them where they're at. I think, in New Mexico, there's this idea that because we're a people of color majority state, that our voting automatically just matches our population. And what we know from numbers after election is that isn't the case, that people of color in our state aren't voting at the same rate to match the population. And I think that as long as people are disenfranchised, where voters are disenfranchised, we don't truly have ethical elections, as long as people are feeling like they're not represented. And so I think what our work is to do is to talk with voters, meet voters where they're at, but also how are we ensuring that people are informed about voting, that they know their rights as voters, and that voters are being protected. I think that election protection and voter protection programs that are happening, not just from OLA, but from our friends at NMEW Vote and Common Cause New Mexico and other organizations, everyone is really thinking about how are we protecting not just the election, not just the integrity of the election, but also how are we protecting voters, especially in a climate where there's a call for voter intimidation coming from the highest office in our country. There is an actual call for and what we've seen in New Mexico is this rise in armed militias. And so I think that when we're looking at this election, it isn't just about really getting out the vote. It's about people knowing their rights, whether they vote by mail, which I've never seen in all the years I've been in New Mexico. I've never seen, and all the years I've done this work, I've never seen vote by mail to this scale. And so I do have to just give a lot of thanks to our secretary, because I know that that is not an easy feat. But it's also making sure that people understand what their rights are attached to that vote by mail, that they do have the opportunity to check on their ballot, that they can, really follow their ballot all the way until and make sure that it's counted. And then it's also about undoing all of the myths as well, because it truly is, I think, voters who are already on the fringe and voters who are already disenfranchised, that's the target. That's the target. I mean, I think it's a tactical decision. It isn't an accident that voters, that Black and brown voters, that Indigenous voters are disenfranchised. They're, democracy wasn't built for us in the first place. And so I think that there are concerted efforts to make sure that we are not voting, or that we're voting in really low numbers. And I'm not saying that's like a concerted effort by the secretary. I'm saying that there are other groups who actually would prefer that people like me aren't voting. And I think that's, for us, where we take our jobs very seriously of engaging what folks refer to as the new American majority.
Well, and you'll remember I've asked the panelists to feel free to comment or question each other. So before we leave this part of the discussion, if anyone has a question for amongst the panelists, please feel free, or a comment even. If not, we can dig in a little bit deeper with, yes, Trevor, go right ahead.
Well, you threw me the first question, and I was so responsive in focusing on it that I didn't say what I wanted to, which is it's just a great pleasure to be with you all in New Mexico today. I have been there a number of times in person, and have had the pleasure of meeting people at Ethics Watch and Justice Bosson and of course Secretary Oliver. So I am glad to be with you all today and to have a chance to meet Andrea as well. What I would say is that we are in this odd sort of hyper-partisan time because of the presidential election, where the issues that normally are not controversial in terms of voting, like absentee balloting versus mail balloting and how things get counted, suddenly have a partisan overlay on them that I think, as you all have been discussing, makes it difficult for public officials to do their job and organizations like Andrea's to get people out to vote, because suddenly it is seen somehow as favoring one party or another to be encouraging people to vote or suggesting one way or another to vote. And that's just the reality we all deal with here. I think the best way to do it is to say, look, that's a national issue. It doesn't really affect what's happening here in New Mexico, where our election officials are playing it by the book. As the secretary said, it's completely transparent. There are observers from both parties throughout this process, including the way votes are counted. Just try to lower the partisan temperature to the extent we can, recognizing that come election day and afterwards, if it's a very close election anywhere, then there are going to be questions you all will have to respond to about how the absentee votes are being counted and who's in the room observing it and things like that.
I think one of the, I'm sorry, Kathleen.
Go right ahead, Andrea.
Trevor, you reminded me in 2018 in the midterms, there was a candidate who declared victory before all of the mail-in ballots and absentee ballots had been counted. And then turns out that person didn't win. So they were, calling it a victory, and then began immediately questioning absentee ballots and the integrity of the election and the integrity of vote by mail, even though there were observers and watchers. And so that's where I really started to slightly joke, but also serious, that it's always fair until you lose is I think the sort of trend that we're seeing with certain candidates where, the system works as long as you're winning, or the system works as long as you're up in the polls, because there are states that are receiving mail from the same person who's shaking up confidence in vote by mail and absentee voting, who are, you know, there's states where they're getting mailers that say, make sure you request your ballot and make sure you vote by mail. And so there's this double speak that happens around, you know, and even we all saw the press conference where it was like, you know, trying to thread the needle on the difference between absentee voting and voting by mail. And it's cutting through all of that. Sometimes you want to just laugh at it because it just seems so ridiculous. And then the consequences of it are so heavy. And so I feel like in New Mexico, that message around not trusting the integrity of the vote and not trusting the integrity of absentee and counting absentee ballots, that started in 2018. And so it feels like we've been hearing it for a really long time because we've been hearing it for a couple of years now.
Yes, and I just want to mention in New Mexico, people can type into their browser votenm.org, and that takes you right to the
NMVote,
NMVote.org. I don't want to be on the side of promoting this information. NMVote.org, and it takes you right to the voter portal on the Secretary of State's website, and there's everything laid out for you. Andrea, I want to dig in with you. We're going to go micro to macro a little bit here now for a minute. You all hosted a voter suppression webinar, and it's available on Ole New Mexico's Facebook page. And I encourage people to watch it. And Madam Secretary, you participated. There's a lot of detailed information there. So people can actually watch that, and we encourage them to. What are some takeaways? Why did you feel that was necessary to do? Even are you experiencing some of that on the ground right now? But I mean, not not disenfranchisement, but actual stopping people from voting.
You know, I think that when we talk about stopping people from voting, you know, and if we're not seeing it, then we don't think it's happening. So if we don't see folks blocking the doors to voting, then it must not be happening. But I think there are subtle and systemic ways. So, you know, I really appreciated the Secretary saying that there are laws that every election official has to follow. It's our experience anecdotally, and I think other election protection folks will tell you the same, that, you know, we've had people who were formerly incarcerated who are eligible to register to vote, who are told by, you know, someone in a county clerk's office, no, you went to prison, you don't get to vote ever again. And that's not real. That isn't true. This person actually completed everything they needed to complete, and they have the opportunity to vote again. And they're being told, no, you don't get to vote, by someone who actually is working in that office. Or we've had people who have been asked, you know, who have been told that they need to present an ID. Voter ID is not, you know, required in statewide elections. And now, thanks to the Local Elections Act, it isn't required anywhere, and that's great. But we still have people being questioned for IDs. And a lot of times we actually work with a lot of people who are naturalized citizens who are voting for the first time, who are older. And so, you know, oftentimes they don't know what their rights are around that, and whether or not they can have a translator, they can have someone help them by reading the ballot to them. And so for us, it's really important that we're putting those messages out there. Also, you know, we are happy that we're a state that eventually reinstates voting rights, but we're part of a larger group that's working toward how do we ensure that people's voting rights aren't taken away in the first place, regardless of whether or not they become incarcerated, you know. And so for us, having that panel was really about, one, really also talking about race, and really being explicit that across the country, but also in New Mexico, people of color are voting at lower rates. And how do we ensure that people know what their rights are around that? And so, yeah, I think that, you know, you have lots of folks who don't know that they can lose their voter registration if they're inactive, and that they have to re-register. And so we've had folks who have gone to vote provisionally who have been told, no, you don't get to do that, even though provisional, you know, ballots are a thing. And so we feel really lucky to have our secretary who always is there to clarify. But we know that there's one Secretary of State who can't be in every polling location throughout the state. And so for us, it really is about how do we make sure that our folks know their rights so that if they do encounter a problem, they can say, actually, no, you're wrong, and here's why, right? And so that for us is why we had that webinar, but also to really highlight and center race, class, and gender and how they're affecting our elections.
Well, and you can sort of break down the process of voting to being able to register for a vote, being able to actually vote, and then being able to make sure your vote is counted. And so it sounds like you're addressing all of that, and thank you for that. And Madam Secretary, I'm curious, hearing Andrea, is there standardized training for poll workers around the state?
Well, that's a good question, Kathleen. Yes and no. At the end of the day, poll workers should all be trained in the responsibilities and the statutes that pertain to their job, and they are. County clerks undertake that really grueling, challenging work of making sure that everybody's well trained. Keep in mind that, typically somebody who is a poll official, maybe works once or twice a year at the polls. And depending on, now, as Andrea mentioned, we have, sort of consistent statutes around no matter what kind of election we're having here in New Mexico with the Local Election Act. But for a while there, if you were working at a general election and then you were working for your city for a municipal election, they function differently. So to make a long story short, yes, they are trained. Each county clerk, though, carries out that training a little bit differently. They each emphasize things a little bit differently because often, and I can say, from my experience as a county clerk overseeing these kinds of trainings, a lot of what we will emphasize has to do with problems that maybe we had in a previous election that we thought we didn't emphasize enough, right? So maybe one election, the challenge in Bernalillo County was we didn't have enough poll officials making sure they were counting the number of folks in line. So we had an accurate, wait time count. And so we maybe emphasized that and did not emphasize enough how to help a voter with a disability, right? And so, these folks are getting maybe 4 hours of training, usually once a year. The more experienced poll workers who've done it year after year have the benefit of having gone through the training and the process multiple times, but then they are also challenged with the laws that change and requirements that change. So at the end of the day, let me just say this, elections are a very delicate balance. They really are. They are often more art than science. And as election officials, we have two really important values to balance in running an election, and that is the balance of access and the balance of integrity. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have great access and great integrity, but you cannot have it perfectly, right? You cannot have either of those perfectly. And so when you are conducting an election and training your poll workers and emphasizing certain things and maybe not emphasizing others in the limited amount of time you have, what you really are doing is trying to strike that balance. And so what I think is what I try to always let people know, and what's really important for them to know, is that because elections are a human process, they are never going to be perfect. What we need to do is make sure that we have adequate transparency, adequate safeguards, and adequate fail-safes in process. So, if you have a situation with a voter who doesn't show up on the voter rolls, they have that provisional ballot option, that they can cast that provisional ballot, and that the county clerk can go back and double and triple check that on the back end and see if that ballot should indeed be counted. And so these are the types of processes that are designed to help strike that really delicate balance that we are challenged with every time we run an election.
And Andrea,
can I add one piece to that? I'm sorry. I think one of the things that we're really excited about in New Mexico, and we were able to work with the Secretary on this, is same-day voter registration and automated voter registration. And, I look at other states and I look at colleagues in other states and some of the nightmare scenarios that are happening there with voter suppression that are outward. And when you look at places like Georgia and Florida, and sort of, it's just really blatant voter suppression. I think that I want to be really clear. I think that that's a spectrum, right? And I think that, like there's things that are really blatant and in your face. And then I think that when we think about all of the subtle messages that people are receiving, again, bots are a real thing. I know we're sort of sick to death of talking about bots, but they're a real thing, and they've gotten smarter, they've gotten better, and so they infiltrate Facebook groups and they infiltrate social media, and they actually learn to mimic the way that group, the language that the group uses, and it actually feels like interacting with a real person. And there's so much work being done to combat that, but yet it's humans who are trying to combat this very technological problem. And so I think that again, the more that people understand, if you're not registered to vote, you can still show up, register, and vote in that same moment. The more that people understand those things, and I think that's what we feel our big lift is to get that word out, particularly to non-traditional voters, then that's where it feels like we have a more even electorate, right? An electorate that actually reflects the needs of our community.
I want to remind attendees that they are welcome to submit questions in the Q&A. I see people are also submitting some questions in the chat, but go ahead and line them up. We'll get to a Q&A portion. Madam Secretary, we saw something new this year. We saw, and it's because we have a state ethics commission, we saw a complaint filed Monday within the 60-day blackout period, but then we saw the person who made the complaint come forward and say, I've accused my opponent of these violations of Governmental Conduct Act, Financial Disclosure Act. I know you have a joint powers agreement with the State Ethics Commission. How is your office going to be involved in that? And what do you think of the appearance of this complaint? Will we see more?
Every election there are complaints. It's sort of a universal. And in my experience, in the 3.5+ years I've been in this office, most of the complaints, while concerning, don't necessarily rise to the level of a Campaign Reporting Act violation or a Governmental Conduct Act violation. With that being said, that really is the purpose of the Ethics Commission, and particularly because the Ethics Commission was created to have many more tools in the toolbox to enforce our ethics laws here in New Mexico than have been given to me in my office. This particular complaint was referred directly to the Ethics Commission. I don't know yet whether they will bring us into that process, but that is part of we have that joint powers agreement, and we have regular dialogue on these matters with the Ethics Commission to kind of discuss how to share those responsibilities, and if it seems appropriate for the purposes of the Ethics Commission to bring us into the equation, we'll come into the equation. And what I will say is this, this issue that you're bringing up about, I remember as the law was making its way through committee hearings, this was one of the bigger concerns that was brought up, is how do we balance, again, here I'm coming back to balance, right? This is the challenge. How do we balance transparency of the process with the ability to protect, the rights of the accused, particularly if the complaint is found to be without merit at the end of the day, or does not, there isn't sufficient evidence. And so these are the paths now that the Ethics Commission is going to have to weave, that we've had to weave over the years. Our policy in my office is that when we receive a complaint, we have a process that we go through no matter what the complaint is. We do the same thing with every single complaint, but we don't necessarily alert the media, right? We're not going to pick up the phone and call the media and say, hey, we got this complaint. But of course, it is the First Amendment right of anybody filing a complaint to make that information public. So at the end of the day, I think what's really, really important is that there is due process, whether it's a complaint that comes to me or to the Ethics Commission There is a process that we will undertake that is going to be consistent in every case. And if the complaint is found to be with merit, we will pursue that situation. And if it's not found to be with merit, we will absolve the situation. And that's the most important thing for folks to know is regardless of whether a complaint has been filed, there is due process in every sense. And it should be important for folks to know that they should try to withhold judgment on the outcome of that process until there is an outcome.
Now, one other thing just to dig in with you a little bit about, I read that today there was a phone call between the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, and the Secretaries of State of all the states. I hope you're not missing that call while you're with us.
Later.
But I'm sure people want to know, there's now a lawsuit out of Colorado because of the postcards that were mailed. What's the status of that here in New Mexico? Have those postcards been mailed? And are they erroneous?
No, so good question. And actually, for me, this will be my second conversation with the Postmaster General. I am currently the president of NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State. A couple of my colleagues and I met with him initially a couple weeks ago to talk about some of the concerns that secretaries have more generally. And briefly, I will say that from the very highest level of the Postal Service, Postmaster DeJoy and his senior staff, down to the local and regional officials here in New Mexico, we have been assured and reassured that elections and mail pertaining to the election ballots applications are the highest priority of the Postal Service over the next couple of months until the election is concluded. But we're in trust but verify mode with them and making sure that we have really good communication and accountability mechanisms in place to make sure that that does happen. Part of that is this conversation with the postmaster later today among all of the secretaries. The postcard is out there. I got mine actually in the mail the same day it was announced that they were being sent out. And there's nothing in the postcard that is not applicable to New Mexico. If you follow the links on the postcard, they will take you eventually to your local and state election officials. But in a place like Colorado, Utah, Washington, Oregon, that automatically mails ballots out, it could be confusing to those voters because it talks about making sure you apply for a ballot in time. And so I do understand the concerns that those other secretaries of state have, which is why we need the postmaster and his staff to communicate with us and let us know in advance, what they're planning to tell the public.
Apparently, one of the mysteries here is that some of those states did contact the postmaster or senior postal officials and say, please do not send this postcard out in our state because it is not accurate for us. It's fine for states where you have to request an absentee ballot, but telling voters they have to make a request when in fact state law says that every registered voter is going to receive a ballot will only scare voters who don't know anything about a request and can't find anything about a request on a website. So that's why Colorado went to court and got a court judgment forbidding the Postal Service from sending more in Colorado because they feared it would confuse Colorado voters because Colorado has a different system. But I agree.
That's right.
New Mexico seems fully consistent with what that postcard was, as is most of the country. So it's just a mystery why the states that are different still got sent that card.
And to add to that, Trevor, so two quick things. To your point, that was one of the requests that we made on the initial call with the Postmaster General and his staff is please let us look at something before you send it out. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, that didn't happen in this case. So the conversation today will be about, okay, we got this commitment from you, but that didn't happen. So how are we going to make sure that it does happen in the future? What assurances can we get? What process can we put in place to make that happen? Number one. Number two, part of the reason why what was on the postcard fits so well with New Mexico is because we, as I mentioned, went to considerable lengths this summer during the special session to draft the bill that pertains to this particular general election in New Mexico to be consistent with those Postal Service best practices and guidelines because we did not want to have exactly this kind of confusion.
So Trevor Potter, in speaking with you or communicating with you ahead of time, I know there's something you and I both want to talk about a little bit. And I was reading a commentator yesterday and he's not a straw man, he just happens to be a music commentator who sometimes commentates on politics. But he said, look, the fight isn't over the vote, the fight is over counting the vote. And he said, we need some bumper stickers. And, you know, he had some that said like, November 3rd is just the beginning. But there's also another one that might say, count every vote. So what's the ethics involved on the part of the media and others in really letting the public know that this is a process that might be extended, probably will be extended beyond November 3rd?
It's a great question, and I think probably the most important point for people to understand as the election unfolds and we get into election week. And I refer to election week because it is pretty clear that with the large number of absentee votes we have in states that are not used to a large number of absentee votes, it will take states a while to count them. And the reason for that is that if early votes are cast by people in person, they're counted on a machine, and on election night, they look at the numbers on the machine and they know how those early voters voted. And those are numbers available within an hour or two of the polls closing. The same will apply to people who vote in person on election day, because again, at the end of the evening, the polls close, the workers look at the totals, they all agree that's what the machines say, they pass those along, the press observes it, and on election night, we are used to hearing vote totals within an hour or two of the polls close. The national news says, Florida has closed and here are the early totals, which are right there. What none of that takes into account is the situation we are going to have this year, where a very large number of voters, clearly more than enough to swing any election, have voted on paper, through the mail, or dropping them off, but in what New Mexico has as an absentee ballot. And the problem is that those are not counted. The states do not begin to count those until at election day and election night. Some states, and the secretary may have information on this, but some states don't even touch the envelopes until election night. So they only then begin the process of looking at the exterior envelope, making sure it looks like a valid official ballot envelope, that the voter has filled out the information on the back as to who they are, that their signature matches something on file, etc. Other states are doing that in advance, meaning looking at the exterior envelope and determining that that is going to be a qualified absentee ballot, but nobody is counting them in advance. So the counting takes a while. And some states, the states that do vote by mail all the time, as we've been talking about, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Utah, now Hawaii, this year California, many of those states have high-speed counting machines because all their ballots come in by mail, they're all the same, and they have a machine that can count them. But most states have machines that count the in-person ballots, which are different in the quality of paper and the format than the absentee ballots. So you cannot take absentee ballots, take them out of the envelope, take them out of the inner secrecy envelope and feed them into the normal voting machines. Instead, you either have to have special machines to do that have been calibrated to these paper ballots, or you have to do it in person. Either way, when you start that on election night, this all means that within an hour of the polls, you cannot say, and here are the absentee ballots, because you're just beginning that process. And it will take a day or 2 days. It is labor intensive. It involves cross-checking, and as we've said, a public process, witnesses from all parties, etc. And so the effect of all that is on election night, at whatever hour the polls have closed and people are reporting results, What we will know is how people who voted on election day or early voted, and not how millions of other people voted, all of whom's votes are equally valid. And so that's the piece of information. And what causes me to refer to election week is there are several days of vote counting. Some ballots got counted in the front end of the process and some in the back, but they're all the same ballots legally and all have to be counted, and that will take some time. So ethically, what the press needs to be reporting on election night is the first ballots that are counted are the following results, but the majority is still out, or a vast percentage of eligible ballots have not yet been counted, and therefore these results don't tell us anything yet about who won this election. And it is going to be important that people understand this is a unified process with several different pieces depending on how people vote, and the only numbers that count are the ones at the end of the unified process when all ballots have been counted. And just in addition to that, which is New Mexico is one of a number of states that does compare signatures. And if there is a question about whether the signature the voter carefully put on the envelope is the same one, and the same person who registered 40 years ago, and whose signature has changed over time, or the same person who registered last year at the DMV on an electronic pad using a stylus and they scribbled something, is that the same as the person who more carefully signed the ballot? When those questions come up, which they will, New Mexico will contact the voters and confirm that they cast that ballot. That takes time. And if you have tens of thousands of signatures being questioned because you have millions of people casting absentee ballots, it will take time for those signatures to be verified, and that will extend the counting period. Now, it may be that you only have 10,000 signatures in question and somebody won the state by 200,000 votes. Then we won't worry about it. It'll happen. Their votes will be verified and counted, but the attention of the entire country will not be on you. If you have 10,000 and somebody won the state by 5,000 votes, then there's going to be a whole lot of attention to where are these absentee votes and why haven't they been tallied yet. So that's going to be a factor in making this potentially nationally, potentially in New Mexico, an election week. And that's something that the press needs to be aware of and remind people, and voters need to understand.
And Madam Secretary, I got an email a week ago asking me what was the plan in New Mexico, and I said, tune in, we will find out. So now we're going to find out.
Sure. Well, first of all, everything Trevor said is exactly right on. I think I spend most of my time when I'm doing interviews with the media, especially national media, talking about what I call normalizing what's normal. The normal process is that it takes days after the election to account for and to tally all the ballots in New Mexico and across the country. And I think that we live in a society that is used to having information right away. And so folks have gotten used to being able to go to bed on election night, basically knowing the outcome of an election or elections, and then thinking the election's over. Meanwhile, your local election officials and your state election officials continue to toil away, and this is for every election, no matter if the margins are wide or small, counting the absentee ballots that came in on election day, qualifying and counting provisional ballots, making sure that ballots that could not be read by a machine for whatever reason are hand tallied and factored into the account, making sure that the number of ballots issued is the number of ballots cast, is the number of ballots spoiled, making sure that all of those numbers are straight and accounted for before the results are certified. You are always going to see a different final certified total in the state canvass than you see on election night, because local election officials have 13 days and the state has 3 weeks then to audit and make sure that everything's counted and adds up. And only then here in New Mexico can we undertake things like recounts in very close races, which, by the way, are required by law. For a very close race, we will automatically undertake a recount no matter what, to make sure that those totals are accurate. In New Mexico, we have at least 5 days before Election Day that county clerks can begin that process. So all of those absentee ballots that have been coming in since October 6th can begin to be scanned, checked for their information. As Trevor said, the signature, and here in New Mexico, the last 4 digits of the social. If there is a problem, the voter will be contacted within 24 hours and have the opportunity to what we call cure that ballot in order for it to be counted. They will be separating inner and outer envelopes. They will be separating ballots from inner envelopes, getting them ready to scan, and they will be scanned. We will have a good portion of absentee results on election night here in New Mexico. What we won't be able to have is anything that came in on election day, either at the polling place or at that last 7 p.m. mail drop that every county clerk is going to get. So there will be outstanding ballots. That is a given. And to Trevor's point, it's really important to understand, depending on how many ballots are outstanding, and hopefully everybody will get the word out, get your ballot in as soon as possible so that clerk can count it as soon as possible so that we have confidence and know the outcome on election night. But there may be a race or two in the state, or quite a few, that we don't know the outcome until at least a few days down the road with those unofficial results.
Right. We're going to jump to a question because it's along these lines, and it says to all panelists, are you anticipating systemic challenges to the absentee ballots all over the country to slow an attempt to delegitimize the paper ballots? Anybody want to jump in?
That's a legitimate fear.
Yeah.
And depending on the state and the jurisdiction and the process there, as I mentioned, there will be outside observers. In New Mexico, we do have a position called the challenger. So representatives of the political parties are able to challenge particular votes if there is a good faith basis to challenge those on. And that would be a situation where somebody who is not registered to vote casts a ballot, somebody who, other than the person who they are claiming to be, casts a ballot. And this applies to mail voting, absentee voting, as well as in-person voting. What I will say is this, however, if there is a bad faith attempt to just, let's say, challenge every ballot, right? If there is a challenger that's operating in bad faith to obstruct the voting process, whether it be in person or in the absentee precinct, the county clerk's duty will be to remove that person, because obstructing the election process and interposing constant bad faith challenges is a method of obstructing the election process. That is forbidden by state law. I can't speak to what other processes are in other states, but I will tell you that your election officials are very well aware that this could be a potential issue, and will do their best, again, to balance, right? Because that's the key, the rights of the challenger to act in good faith and the, and prohibiting them from acting in bad faith to obstruct the process. And, that at the end of the day is going to be the key.
Trevor, I think you're on mute.
I am. My apologies. I would add to what the Secretary has said on a nationwide basis that every state has a series of laws in place to dictate how ballots are counted and how any challenges are made to that counting process and to the legitimacy of the ballots, as the Secretary has explained. And certainly those processes will be gone through. So if there is a question about a signature or an issue of when the ballot arrived or whether someone is a registered voter, those sorts of issues would be fair game. And I would anticipate that if there's a state with a close election, lawyers from both parties would be looking at the voters and the ballots to ensure that everyone was qualified, both to ensure that every vote got counted that should have been and that no votes got counted that shouldn't have. Now, what the Secretary mentioned, and I think the question implies, is the possibility that people would attempt to engage in extra legal, meaning not through the legal process, but protests or other efforts to disrupt vote counting. We had an example of that way back in 2000 in Florida in what is called the Brooks Brothers riot, referring to people in blue blazers like mine who were banging on the windows and doors and scaring the election officials into getting them to stop counting ballots. That is an unlawful disruption of the election system, and nobody has the right to do that, whichever candidate that they are supporting. And so I trust the Secretary is correct that when things like that happen, the election officials and law enforcement officials will ensure that the votes are counted legally, properly, as required by law, and that the people who are doing that are protected from anyone who is trying to disrupt the system, because we are all entitled to an accurate final vote count of every legal ballot. And anything that attempts to disrupt that is simply not acceptable in a democracy.
You know, and sometimes we don't want to talk about worst case scenarios because we think we might be inviting them. But it seems to me at this point, people are starting to say, we need to talk about worst case scenarios. We need to have things in place if this happens, if that happens, if there's this challenge, if there are people who show up with guns. And, you know, so, you know, I'm glad we're having this conversation because I think everybody needs to be thinking about these things and realizing we have things in place to handle what might arise. I'm going to jump to another question. Let's see. Would the government regulate the bots or social media in general if it's interfering with elections without infringing on our privacy and rights? Anybody have an answer for that?
Well, I think that the threats have been well documented, and we've seen there's been little attention paid by governing bodies who could, at the federal level, who could actually look at this as a threat to our democracy. And so I think that look, I mean, we even have rating systems for TV shows, right? So to say like, you know, the government doesn't have a place to do, I mean, if Sesame Street has a rating system, then you can't tell me that, you know, there's no like reach into ensuring that there isn't interference in our voting system through social media. Like, you know, you have the head of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, basically a few months ago saying like, yeah, there's these threats, I'm not gonna do anything about it, right? And so, you know, and you have Twitter after finally years and years of, you know, misinformation, finally they're putting like these little labels on their tweets. And so they absolutely do have the capacity for regulation, whether or not they're doing it. And look, I think that, I think it's a slippery slope. I think that it's oftentimes people of color and social justice movements that are censored first, or now this like quote unquote Antifa, right? I think that those are the folks who are censored first. So I don't think that I'm not necessarily saying, I'm sorry, there's a loud vehicle that just went by. I'm not necessarily saying like we just got to censor all of it, but I think that when we're talking about that there's this actual threat to our voting systems, there's this, and it's known and it's credible and there's reports about it. And we've sort of just had an administration that hasn't wanted to do anything about it because they benefit from it. That's where I think someone needs to step in, right? How far reaching that goes, that's a conversation I don't know if we have time for this morning.
You know, and I just briefly add to that, you know, I agree with everything Andrea just said. And I do think that there is more that can be done to regulate intentional mis and disinformation around elections, although it's, again, that balance that we have to strike between the First Amendment and, deliberate election interference. But, one of the things I'll point out is that I think that the biggest story, we all think the biggest story that came from the Mueller report was that it led to the eventual impeachment of the president. But to me, the biggest story that came out of the Mueller report was that they were actually able to identify and make arrests and bring charges against Russian nationals who, on behalf of the Russian government, engaged in a deliberate attempt to interfere with the 2016 election. And that is a perfect example of when you have a Department of Justice official, right, doing his job to do an investigation into one matter, but ends up coming across evidence of this type of activity, trying to bring these folks to justice. That is what we need to be doing more of. And so, my hat's off to Robert Mueller for that.
We're getting to the point of the program where we're going to soon switch over to the students, but I do have one more question. It's from one of our state ethics commissioners, Stuart Bluestone, and I want to make sure we get to it. It's for you, Trevor. And I know it's going to be hard to answer it briefly, but we'll give it a try. So here's Stuart's question. Assuming Trump claims victory early on election night or refuses to concede defeat, what do you envision as the most likely court challenges that will be brought, and how and when will they wind up in the U.S. Supreme Court? Please also comment on the dangers that could happen if, for whatever reasons, electoral college votes are not certified and properly submitted in the required deadline time. That's not something that you might be able to answer briefly, but you could give it a shot.
I'll try to be brief. First, I would fully expect that both candidates will claim victory on election night, and that both candidates will not concede the next day because there's too much of the process ahead. As we've been discussing, there'll be some huge percentage of the national vote that will not be counted the day after the election. So of course they're going to say, I won, and the counting is going to prove that to be the case. The process proceeds from there. Every state certifies their results after a process that involves potentially a recount, maybe some contests, etc. At that point, we may have an obvious electoral college winner. And at that stage, the system goes on to essentially autopilot. The electoral college votes are cast. They're counted by Congress in open session. Everyone can see the result. And then on inauguration day, January 20, under the Constitution, the incumbent president and vice president turn into pumpkins. Their term ends at noon. They've either been reelected or somebody else has been elected by the Electoral College. That goes quickly to the issue of, well, what happens if the electoral votes from the states are not clear by the appropriate deadline? And there is a provision in the law that says if a state produces a certification of its electors by December 8th this year, then that is the presumptive vote. Congress will accept those as the vote. That certification is signed by the governor. So if everything is resolved by then, fine. If it's not resolved by then in a state, the question is, does it make any difference? If it's a state whose votes are not going to determine the outcome because one or the other candidate has won based on every other state, then it doesn't matter. If it does make a difference, if it's the swing state and it hasn't figured out by December 8 who won there, or there are arguments that both sides are saying we won, then that's something that goes to Congress. If there's not a majority in the Electoral College, then there is a procedure where Congress has to look at this and determine which slate to accept and who won. But I can assure everyone listening, there is a procedure. And on January 20, there will be somebody who is sworn in as president, or in the absolute worst case scenario, which is also provided for by the Constitution, somebody who is sworn in as acting president until such time as the issue has been resolved and there is a president duly elected.
I'm sure our attendees feel the same way. I could hear all of you smart, passionate people working front and center on the election for a long time today, but we do have to move to the next part of our program. So I want to give each of you a chance to just close up a little here. Tell us, what you'd like us to keep our eye on, how you'd like us to trust the process, whatever it is that you want to leave us with today. And Andrea, let's go ahead and start with you, please.
Thank you so much. I feel very lucky that we actually have such an accessible secretary that we've been able to work with, that we've been able to ask questions directly. And I think that the more that we can continue having these conversations about the realities of elections, not just like the ideal democracy that we'd like to see, but what's really happening. And the more that we can strive to actually have a representative electorate, I think that's where we're going to see, and because we've already begun to see how much elections can shift and create a whole new life for New Mexicans. Since 2016, we've seen voting rates, they haven't declined. They've actually continued to increase. Voter turnout numbers in school board races and the midterms, and then I think, in the primaries, this year compared to what we saw in 2016, it just continues to rise. And so with that, I think the more that we have these kinds of conversations, the stronger that we're going to see our voting systems in New Mexico. So I just really appreciate being able to be part of this conversation.
And Andrea, I really appreciate you being here today and taking some of your time out from the great work that you've been doing. So thank you for joining us. This is a great panel. I hope we'll get a chance to maybe convene again. Madam Secretary, how would you like to close today, please?
Sure. Well, I've talked a lot today about all the different processes that are in place to ensure the integrity and the transparency and the accuracy of our elections. And I hope that if you didn't know some of those things, that you took some of them away with you, maybe can rest your head a little bit easier at night. I know there are a lot of nervous, anxiety-ridden folks out there because not only is this probably the most highly scrutinized election of our time, it's happening during the middle of a global pandemic, which is not the least to say about this election year, right? The challenges that has created. But let me leave you with this. Here in New Mexico, as well as in states across the country, your election officials, regardless of their partisan background, are working extremely hard to make sure that this election is successful, that it has integrity at the very most national level, that we do convene all of those electoral college electors in our states on that day in December when they are supposed to convene, that the processes and laws in each of our states are followed. And the most important thing to know is whatever you see out there on the internet or in social media, especially if it raises questions for you, go to the source. Go to your local or your state election official. We have a huge campaign through our National Association of Secretaries of State called Trusted Info 2020. We are your trusted sources of information. And again, even if you don't agree with me politically or with the decision that I've made, you can believe that the information that you can find on my website and on your local county clerk's website is the accurate information about how, where, and when to cast your ballot. And so always go to the source if you ever have any questions or any doubts about the election process.
And Madam Secretary, thank you also for your time. And I'll echo what Andrea said. We really appreciate your accessibility. It is, it's wonderful, and we appreciate it here in New Mexico. Thank you so much. Trevor Potter, your turn to close here. Thank you for joining us from DC.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you. Today happens to be Constitution Day, the day that is set aside to celebrate the fact that we have a Constitution over 200 years old. You may recall when Benjamin Franklin was approached by a woman outside of Constitution Hall in Philadelphia when the convention was breaking. She said, "Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?" Meaning, what sort of government? And he responded, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that's something that all of us as citizens have an obligation to keep in mind this year. The Constitution has been amended many times over the years. It has changed from a document that presumed that the voters would be white male property owners, a tiny segment of the real population, to include formerly enslaved people, minorities, in a breakthrough for half the country, women 100 years ago. And it is an opportunity through the Constitution for all of us to exercise our right to determine who our government will be. That's what we do in a democracy. And I only hope that as people vote this year and get excised about their candidate or the other candidate and begin to think the world is going to come to an end if their person doesn't win, that they remember the Constitution has to go on, and all of us have to operate within the rule of law in order for this country to survive as it is. So at some stage, a little less partisan heat and a little more understanding that we're going to live and work together, and that we have a system that can work for us in this election and in this counting process if we let it, is what we all need.
Well, and thank you for that reminder, Trevor, and that moderating viewpoint. Really appreciate it. And thanks again, everybody, for a very civil, informative discussion. Really appreciate it. And like I said, let's do it again sometime. And we'll give your best to our students if you're going to be leaving. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks all.
All right, be well.